And now we get to chapter 28B, and then this is the part of California history in the 1940s, which had a lot to do with American politics as well. And we talk about the spurious issue of loyalty. In 1938, Congress created what was called the House Un-American Activities Committee under the acronym of HUAC. One of its earliest targets of its anti-communist investigations was the film industry in Hollywood. Eventually, 250 actors, writers, and directors were banned from further employment. In other words, they were blacklisted. Whether they were actually members of the Communist Party or not, even if they refused to testify, they were still blackballed and could not get work in certain parts of the film industry, or maybe not even at all. Um, Ronald Reagan, who was the Screen Actors Guild or SAG union president from 1947 to 1952, fully cooperated with HUAC. Other actors risked their careers to speak out against HUAC and not testify at the anti-communist hearings that were being conducted by the House Un-American Activities Committee and also by Senator Joseph McCarthy in the U.S. Senate. If you want to watch an interesting movie about this, uh, there was a movie that came out in 2006, I want to say, 2007, starring, I think it was, his name was Richard Strawthern, uh, and a few other familiar faces. Robert Downey Jr., Patricia Clarkson. The movie was actually done in black and white, and it was done by George Clooney, and it was called Good Night and Good Luck. It had to do with the journalistic career of CBS News newsman Edward R. Murrow, and I kind of have a personal connection to this, and I'll tell you why. That's because one of the individuals that the House Un-American Activities Committee was seeking out to try to bring to trial or bring to hearing was a fellow by the name of Milo Radulovich, who lived in Michigan, and he was an Army Reserve meteorologist. And they were trying to pick on him because his sister read a Serbian newspaper. And of course, Serbia was then part of Yugoslavia, which is part of Eastern Europe, which was communist. All right. So they really harassed him, and finally, Milo Radulovic himself said, "Hey, if they get me, then they can go after anybody. Guilt by association, which is ridiculous." In any case, the personal connection is this: Milo Radulovic eventually was exonerated, and they dropped the case. And he actually went to work for the U.S. Weather Bureau in Sacramento, now the National Weather Service, and was a meteorologist there. And one of his daughters, Kathy Radulovich, was a year behind me in high school in Fair Oaks, California. So it's really kind of interesting about the House Un-American Activities Committee. So watch that movie, Good Night and Good Luck. Um, in the 1930s, Republicans, of course, were labeled the party of the Depression, not really deserved. In the 1950s, the Democrats were labeled as the party of communism, which, of course, was not really deserved. In the congressional elections of 1946, now that we were in this Cold War era, the Republicans gained control of both the Senate and the House, even though there was a Democrat in the White House, Harry Truman. Um, in the House freshman class that year was a Republican by the name of Richard Nixon of Whittier, California, who was a young attorney who won for Congress in 1946 against Jerry Voorhis, who was his opponent, his Democratic opponent. And he won in part by accusing that his Democratic opponent, Voorhis, was a communist, which in fact he was not. And Nixon even admitted as such after the election. He said that, I knew that Jerry Voorhis wasn't a communist, but if I didn't say so, I never would have won the election. Interesting, isn't it? Uh, Nixon discovered convincing evidence against a fellow by the name of Alger Hiss um that he was a communist. And even though Alger Hiss actually served in the security apparatus of the United States government, they did find credible evidence that he was a communist. He served in the State Department during World War II. He denied that he was a communist and was convicted of perjury on January 21st, 1950, for denying the charges. But later on, in the 1990s, when the Soviet Union was no longer the Soviet Union and it was Russia, and people had access to certain documents, it was discovered that in fact he was an operative for the Soviet Union. Um, then there was Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin. McCarthy, however, was not successful in uncovering a single person in government service who was a communist, in spite of his really very dramatic hearings and his basically he was on this witch hunt. Nixon, however, of course, succeeded in doing so by unearthing Alger Hiss. So this put Nixon on the political fast track, and there he is with other members of the House Un-American Activities Committee, including their counsel, who is standing to his left. Nixon defeated Democratic Congresswoman Helen Gahagan Douglas in 1950 for the U.S. Senate race from California. He was then nominated for the vice presidency in 1952 on the Eisenhower ticket. And of course, in November 1952, the Eisenhower-Nixon ticket defeated Democrats Adlai Stevenson and then Sparkman in the 1952 election. Meanwhile, at the state level, the California legislature back in the late 1930s and early 1940s actually formed their own fact-finding committee on un-American activities. Suspects were bullied by Republican State Senator Jack B. Tenney of Los Angeles, who was in the state Senate for 3 terms from 1942 to 1954. At Tenney's insistence in 1949, get this, the University of California Regents adopted a loyalty oath that professors and university employees alike actually had to take. They actually had to take this loyalty oath, which was really quite crazy when you think about it. Uh, really quite something. Uh, UC President Gordon Sproul asked the regents to repeal it, and then Regent John Francis Nalen led a majority of the board in refusing to repeal the loyalty oath. And what was interesting is you remember him because he was the same Nalen who once accepted the case of Charlotte Anita Whitney, appealed her conviction for criminal syndicalism all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. So this fighting liberal of early years, according to your textbook, was still fighting, but no longer liberal. He was, in fact, a strong admirer of Senator McCarthy from Wisconsin, who was on that communist witch hunt. Governor Warren urged repeal of the oath. It did not happen. Some professors refused to sign the loyalty oath. In August 1950, the regents voted 12 to 10 to dismiss 32 professors at Cal Berkeley who refused to sign the loyalty oath. UC Berkeley psychology professor Edward C. Tolman sued, and the state Supreme Court ordered reinstatement of those professors and basically threw out the loyalty oath. The state legislature enacted the Levering Act, which was also another loyalty oath for all state employees in 1950, but the state Supreme Court threw that out in 1967. So now let's go to the governorship of Edmund G. Brown Sr., otherwise known as Pat Brown, because when he was in junior high school in San Francisco, he was known as Patrick Henry Brown because of advocating the selling of war bonds to support World War I in 1917. He became the district attorney of San Francisco in 1944. He became state attorney general in 1950. He's a Democrat. He ran for governor in 1958 against Republican William F. Noland, who hoped for victory so that he, Noland, could use that position as governor as a stepping stone for eventual nomination by the Republican Party to run as their presidential candidate in 1960. That, of course, did not happen because Brown won in 1958, carrying 56 of 58 of California's counties. Noland's conservative right-to-work law also failed. He wanted to have open shop in California as the law, as other states had, and that initiative did fail. So Noland was out on two accounts. He didn't win the governorship, and his initiative failed for a right-to-work law. Brown proposed, and the legislature passed, a number of liberal measures at the time that we sort of take for granted today. The Fair Employment Practices Act increased payments for unemployment insurance, for disability, and for workers' compensation due to injury on the job. It also initiated an Office of Consumers Counsel, so consumers could be protected from shoddy products and shoddy sales. There was a state economic development agency that happened during this time. There were tax increases for schools, crime control, and highways. And because of the master plan for higher education, which was approved in 1960, you as a student may not be watching this PowerPoint today because that was a Pat Brown policy. The biggest thing he probably did, though, was to get passed on the California ballot after the legislature approved it a water bond. It was a bond for water development for the State Water Project, which was passed by the legislature in 1959, approved by the voters in November of 1960. This was the State Water Project, which would then circumnavigate the 160-acre federal limitation by having a state water project. We'll talk about left-wing extremists more in another chapter, but for now I'll focus on right-wing extremists. One group called the John Birch Society was founded in California in 1958 by Robert Welch, who was a retired candy manufacturer. John Birch was an Army captain. That was the namesake of the society, and he was considered by conservatives to be the first martyr of the Cold War when he was killed in a confrontation with Chinese communists in 1945. Members of the John Birch Society believe, and there's still that organization still exists today. You can look them up on the internet. They have a website. That income tax, Social Security, the United Nations, and racial integration in public schools were all communist plots, and that Eisenhower, Truman, and Earl Warren were all communist agents. Nixon, remember Richard Nixon? Well, he lost the presidency, of course, to John F. Kennedy in 1960, and then he ran for governor of California against Pat Brown in 1962. The Birchers were a liability for Nixon in the 1962 campaign, so he distanced himself from them. That cost him some of his right-wing support. Nixon tried to cast Brown as a left-wing extremist, which certainly was not the case. Nixon also approved a tactic of a postcard poll pretending to come from an actually non-existent group of Democrats, condemning the California Democratic Council as communist. Nixon lost the gubernatorial election of 1962. The brainchild of this postcard poll, this fake postcard poll, was actually one of his campaign managers by the name of H.R. Haldeman. And if you know about Watergate, that is a familiar name to you. And Nixon, in fact, admitted in an interview many years later that this postcard poll campaign was a warm-up for Watergate. I want to play for you the portion of a 16-minute Nixon concession speech when he lost the governorship. It's really interesting to listen to. So in case you were wondering where that came from, well, that's where that saying came from. Then he became a partner in a New York law firm after that. JFK, of course, was elected to the presidency in 1960, was assassinated in November 1963. Lyndon Baines Johnson became president in 63. He ran and won in a landslide in 64. Republicans were split between moderates and conservatives. Goldwater was a very conservative Republican candidate. Then, of course, this put Reagan on the horizon for 1966. And, of course, eventually, in 1968, Richard M. Nixon was nominated by the Republicans in 1968 as their presidential candidate, and he beat Hubert Humphrey in November of 1968. So there you have politics in California, Nixon style, and the governorship of Pat Brown.